Sleeping was a huge problem. They'd come in because they had to work in the kitchen and they got up at 4 in the morning and they were tired because it was too noisy in their unit. And so we were constantly waking people up. But Mr. Skinner came in, was very sweet, sat down, put his head down like this. Well, that doesn't work. So I hauled him out in the hall and said, you know, do you have problems with your schedule? Is there a better time for you to be in school? And he didn't say much for a while, and but I could tell he wanted to. And he said, Mrs. Wenzel, I live in Flint, and I watched both of my parents be killed in front of me. So the trauma he was feeling was, and there weren't trauma programs. We had psychologists, but there wasn't anywhere that he could really go and get over that. So I suggested that he take a couple of semesters off, and he eventually came back. But that was very, very common, that kind of thing. And yet they were so caring and so compassionate. So I want to read you about a couple of people. On Fridays, which was a really busy day because all of the religious services met, and we had to figure out which room everybody was in, students sat in a circle and shared something they found beautiful. I called it Gather Around Great Things. They shared beloved poems, paintings, and people they admired. I wanted it to be their activity and thought the first weeks went well as I listened to from my desk. One Thursday, Mr. Jason said, I need to see you in the hall. This whole Friday thing just ain't going right, he said. And I don't really care what you say. I gotta take it over. Not only that, but you gotta be in it, and you gotta bring your own beautiful stuff in. He hadn't ever stepped forward like that. The next day, he did take over. He made the circle smaller. He sat on the top of his desk and he said, you're sitting right next to me. Okay, you guys, he said, this is what's going to happen. We start with this guy, and then she's going to share something at the end, too. After several people had taken their turn, a man said, I got to pass. My mother is dying, and I just can't do it today. He turned to the next person. Wait here just a minute. We got to go back, said Mr. Jason. Hey, man, we got your back, and I bet you can do it today. He turned to the next person. The man did, spinning out his guilt and his grief. Thanks, I feel better, he said. Mr. Jason allowed a little silence before moving on. The circle continued as I watched Mr. Jason lead the group, seeming to know exactly how to respond to each man. What did I know about being locked up with the twins of loss and beauty living side by side in their hearts? How would I know how men cope with the inhumane conditions and still manage to push on? How they found beauty in desolation, found beauty because of their desolation. Mr. Jason knew. He knew he was exploring, as he was exploring, his own reservoirs of courage, dignity, and loving kindness. So, Nelson Mandela said this, a saint, I am not a saint, unless you think a saint is someone who keeps on trying. So these were people who, man, some of them were reading below 4th grade. They would hang in there and hang in there year after year after year, come into class, put their heads down and work for 2 hours, go back, take another class, go to work. All inmates were required to work, so they were orderlies in the units, keeping them clean. They were working in the chow hall, which was really hard, and they worked in the factory. But they stuck with it year after year after year until they could put that red cap and gown on and graduate. There's a thing about violence that we are struggling with right now. If somebody's been violent, we think we have to lock them up forever. And what I saw was that people who had committed violent crimes did so as young men, and they grew out of that. It was youthful behavior. They didn't know how to be reflective. They didn't know how to say to themselves, this doesn't work. So we're keeping people in there who just do not belong. Mr. Knox was one of them. He had really bad teeth, long, straggly, dirty hair, disheveled clothes, He looked kind of scary, and one day the lieutenant brought around the black book, and the black book was a place teachers were supposed to look at the most dangerous inmates that were there. So there's Mr. Knox in the picture, and the lieutenant has me in the hall, and he said, "You really got to watch him. He is really bad. We're worried about you, and you really got to watch him." He was so sunny and so kind and such an amazing student. So let me read about him. He exuded all kinds of positive energy, coming into the room with a smile and a friendly greeting every day. He would often stop and tell me that he pondered a question or an issue from the day before. He wasted no time in class, working hard the whole time. Popular among his fellow students, he smiled and laughed all the time. When he discovered poetry, like many of them, he fell over the cliff in love with it, acting like he'd been given the best gift of his life. He came bouncing in one morning with a big grin and said, "Mrs. Wenzel, you need to know you kept me up all night with this." He was holding a beautiful poem he had written, reworked and tweaked for hours. It was called Wild Grace. I wish I'd asked him for a copy. I used to have a Quaker friend of mine, Dr. David Bassett, come in a lot, and he would talk to the students about his life. And one day I said, "Would you talk about people you admire?" So he talked about Albert Schweitzer and various other people. I can still see Mr. Knox pulling his chair as close to our honored guest as he could. He hung on every word as if David was waking up something in him. I remember the radiance in the student's face as if there was a light shining on his essential goodness, and all of his goodness was coming to life. I think about how many men told me that their biggest mistake was not the crimes they committed, but dropping out of school. After knowing how many people woke up to their goodness and light like Mr. Knox, I wonder what happens to the thousands and thousands of people behind bars who don't have the opportunity for comprehensive, challenging educational opportunities. And by the way, we still have 2.3 million people locked up, and tens of thousands who are on paper and who are formally incarcerated. So I put him in the category of saints. He was a violent criminal and then reformed, and he was finding what was beautiful in himself and trying so hard. I had another student that, there are several who just live with me all the time. Mr. Edmondson was a young black man who, oh boy, he didn't want to work, and would just say, "No, well, I don't really want to do that." So we said, "Take a semester off and think about this," and then he'd come back and work a little harder, but not enough, so you take it off again. But if the lesson plan had something to do with deeper things, he was all over it. And I was getting a little meditation flyer in the mail that had quotes and little tiny paragraphs, and he saw it on my desk one day and he said, "Can I have that?" I said, "Sure." So I kept giving them to him, and he was in the program for like 4 years, finally got his act together, and finally graduated. He was plenty competent enough. And he wrote me this one time: "Sorrow is better than laughter because our heart is made better. Those who do not let sorrow do their work, trivialize it, and try to explain it away, remain shallow and indifferent. They never understand themselves or others very well. In fact, I think before we can become good citizens, we must learn about sorrow. It can uncover hidden depths in ourselves. Sorrow causes us to think earnestly about ourselves. It makes us ponder our mistakes, our intentions, our interests. We get to know ourselves as never before. Grieving also helps us see God as we've never seen him. Sorrow is my fuel." So, one more story, and then I'd love to take some questions. So, Mr. Moore was a 6'3", very dark-skinned black guy. No hair, like a lot of them, shaved their heads. He was so flaky, couldn't remember his notebook, never handed things on time. He kept losing points for not handing things on time. Just shoveled papers falling over. So early in the winter, all the inmates were issued knit caps. So picture 1,600 men wearing bright neon orange caps. They look like elves or something. So he came in one day and said, Ms. Wenzel, I lost my hat. This is about a week after they got him. So I helped him look in the classroom. Couldn't find it. So the second day he comes back. He said, well, it might still be here. I said, Mr. Moore, go to the laundry and ask for another one. Obviously, it's not in here, so you probably lost it outside. The third day, he came back and broke one of my cardinal rules. There were so many interruptions with loudspeakers, and the officers would burst in, and I tried so hard to keep the integrity of time in my group, and he barged into my class, jiggled the door, poked his head in and said, Ms. Wenzel, the laundry won't let me have my hat. So I snapped. So I said, I want to see you in the hall. My teeth were clenched. I just had everything. Get out in the hall. I put my hands on my hip. I look up at him and I say, do I look like your mother? He looks down at me and he says, you know you do. So I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
How did you get interested in that kind of work? Or
yeah, good question. So I had an elementary. I raised my kids in Alpena, and I went back to work as a substitute when the kids got a little older. And I realized that though I taught 5th and 6th grades in kindergarten, I didn't belong in elementary. So I came to Ann Arbor, went to Michigan, and beefed up in English and Social Studies majors. Got a secondary certificate. Well, every 60 in Ann Arbor there's an English teacher, so I had a hard time getting a job, and I went all over the state, all over Southeast Michigan, and about mid-September I thought, I've got to start substitute again, I needed the money. So I went down to Milan and put myself on the substitute list, and the woman said, you need to check across the hall. There's a full-time high school completion program at the federal prison. I didn't even know there was a federal prison. Most people don't, they're quiet. So what I say is, I was hired immediately. What I say is, a short walk across the hall changed my life. And it took me for a while to get a full-time job, and it took me years to figure out how and what to teach these people. I was a little white girl from the north. I had no idea how to teach people of color. And people of color need materials about them. And what they would say is, if I had this stuff in school, I wouldn't have dropped out. And I thought, how would I have felt if I had to go to school? Well, I did go to school in northeastern Quebec in high school. And I remember learning Canadian history and thinking, this is really boring. And I didn't do well at all. In fact, I failed the year because I failed French. So you have to be engaged in the material. And we now have better materials, but in the mid-'80s we did not. It was all about white people. And things were in the margin. And Mr. C would point out, you see, that white people don't notice those little stories in a box. But we know we're marginalized. We get that right away. We're not part of the fabric of the story. So one of my gifts working there was I learned a lot about, well, I knew this much of what there is to learn, but about history and culture of people who aren't white.
So do you use your book and any connections you have to continue to advocate for other prison systems and trying to get this program back rejuvenated again? I worked so hard to write grants and keep the program going that I'm sort of out of energy for doing that. My main purpose of writing the book was to tell people these are lovely people behind bars. Not all of them. There are people who belong there and they should stay there. But we have put people, my tutor, Chris, who is Jamaican, got a 33-year sentence for a drug offense. And he got out in only 22 years because Congress figured out back in, let's see, this would have been in 2009, how much it was costing. It cost at least 35 grand to keep an inmate for a year. So they let people out that had these extremely long sentences. I knew another guy who got 40 years for a drug offense. That's ridiculous. So I'm trying to shine a light on that, and I'm trying to say, these are really good people. And not only does it harm the people, but you can imagine, you take a young dad out of a struggling community in the inner city of Detroit, you leave his kids without parents, without a father, without his wages. He's not supporting his parents. I mean, it's done tremendous damage to Black inner city families and communities, tremendous damage. So that's another thing I'm trying to get across.
Do you have people that are with you that?
I had one person at another church one time who got really angry and left really fast, and I thought something happened to her. She was hurt by something, but that's it. I've talked to 50 groups. So, yeah, but good question. I knew within a couple of years that I had a story to write.
It looks like you might be selling copies of your book.
I am,
and if
yep.
so, what's the price?
$20.
Okay.
Yep. They were funny, they were so warm and so accepting of me and so patient. My friend Chris would write me letters almost every Friday. I'd go home. When I retired, I had 3 notebooks filled with his letters, and he would just explain, you know, you come from white privilege, and you need to expand your knowledge, and you need to say that, and blah, blah, blah. He, by the way, went home the same year I did. He left in May and I left in September or November. And he called me from Jamaica, and we know each other so well because we spent so much time together, and I could pick up that he was really struggling the first 2 years. And then he put together, well, we were writing grants together, so he got enough money from USAID and from the European Union to build a community center in his old neighborhood. And he's running it, and it has everything from preschool programs to senior citizen programs, and it's flourishing. He's doing really, really well. So he's working on a sound studio. He said that his neighborhood, this is the neighborhood he grew up in, it used to be known for reggae music, and so he's got 2/3 of the funding for a really sophisticated sound studio, and he's working with young boys, wanting to teach them the logistics and the business and the technicalities of music. So he said, it is our #1 industry. So it's just a joy to hear him. I knew, and I said to him, when did you plan all this? Because I didn't hear a word of this. And he said, every night when I went to bed, I put another brick in place. I planned it while I was asleep. So that's how I did my job. So they are capable of doing all kinds of things. Some of them were so smart. And another reason why they dropped out of school is school was boring. It didn't meet their needs. It was just tedious and awful. So
Was your next book going to be the good stories that came out of all of it? The updates?
I've been told by way too many people that it needs to be a film. So I'm going to attempt.
And that's going to inspire people if you share stories like that. That's what people need to hear and to see that people can make a difference.
Yeah. I was known as being strict, and that took me a while to realize that to make them work seemed overwhelming, and then I realized that I had to make them work, and Chris used to tell me, I don't care if they're scared, start right now and tell them how much they don't know, and they've got to really shape up here, and they've got the 4-letter word work. So I made them work hard, but they were, they knew, and I would say, I'm wanting you to work hard because I care, and they heard that. And they were so good to me. I flew across my driveway one year and slipped and fell and smashed bones in my ankle and my leg, so I had to have surgery, and the warden wouldn't let me come to work until I could walk on my own, and so I missed 2 months of work, and then I had to come in, and we just extended the semester. And that class was just, I couldn't teach sitting down, so they would push me to do that because I wasn't supposed to stand so much. They'd get me tea in the morning, they'd come in and clean up the room. If I walked down the hall, they were flanking me. They were so good to me. I talked about my dad a lot. My dad was an exemplary citizen. And when he died, we had a
funeral in Montreal, and then had another one at the senior center. And when I came back from that, I got home, I remember, really late at night from the airport, and I had to go to work the next morning. And the men were, amazing. When I walked into the complex where everything was, there was this group of former students I hadn't seen in a long time. They had asked when I was coming back. They put themselves on call-out, which meant they were changed on the computer. They surrounded me and said, here's a card for you, and we're praying for you, and we're so sorry about your father. They felt like they knew him, because he was a really great citizen, and I used to talk to him, and he came in and visited. So, they were so kind. They were so kind. They're just like everybody else is the problem, but because we have a punitive prison policy, then we think they're all bad people. They're just like the rest of us who make mistakes. And mistakes are what we need to talk about, because we all make them. And it's how we learn. I became a better teacher because I made mistakes.
This is just so different from what I think or what I hear, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I've never heard this kind of message before
Right.
about prisons.
Right.
I mean, why is that? Why is that? It's just.
Yep, my family lives in Quebec, and the Canadian system is very, very different. And they don't, because they rehabilitate in Canada and put good people in jail and get them out as quickly as they can and tell them how to go out and function in the real world. They don't have this idea that they're awful, bad people like we do. We really demonize people.
And we don't allow them to get jobs even? I mean, so many times if you've got something on your record, you can't get a job.
Right, right,
Yeah, and you
right.
can't vote, I don't think you can vote. I mean,
You can, yeah, that's different in every state.
Yeah.
Yeah, Florida just was one of the worst, and they just reinstated voting rights for X.
Yeah.
And that language is changing. It used to be ex-felon, and so that immediately conjures up, well, he was a felon. Felon is a very powerful word.
Yeah.
So a friend of mine spent 28 years in the Michigan system, and he says formerly incarcerated, or the one I like better is returning citizens. They don't lose their citizenship when they go to jail.
Yeah.
They're still citizens when they get out. So things are changing, but very slowly. And the Trump administration just cut 14% of its staff in federal prisons. So my program is barely holding on anyway, and now there's no way. I probably brought easily 100, probably 125 people in as guests from all over Ann Arbor, and now you can't have any guests. The program's down to 2 teachers. I mean, it's ridiculous. So
Well, what is the rationale for that?
for
Cutting back?
We were state funded, and because all schools are getting smaller and smaller amounts, and teachers aren't getting paid, and blah, blah, blah. Nobody cares about people like this. When I started teaching, this was under adult education, and adult education funding was very healthy. And then Governor Engler came in and said, "You want to get rid of all adult ed, that was stupid." So that's where we are. And now with, dwindling, teachers are having a really hard time right now. Schools are having a really hard time. So it doesn't surprise me that we're not funding prison education. I worry about the First Step Act, because they're talking about classes inside prison, and as I said, they are programmed and trained to think of these people as bad and evil. So the men picked that up really fast. There were a few teachers that were okay, especially in the trades, but most of them didn't work. I mean, these are people we don't care about. They're throwaway people. And I do not hesitate to call some of them saints. They were amazing. They were just amazing. So we all make mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's how we learn.